Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Victober, a great old BookTube event where we celebrate the literature of the Victorian era. This will be my last Victober video for 2023 as I slowly segue, I metamorphose, I pupate from one great old BookTube event, Victober, to another great old BookTube event, Nonfiction November. And since I gravitate to nonfiction anyway, a lot of the Victorian reading that I've been doing in October has been nonfiction. The Victorians excelled in all forms of artwork, not just all forms of literature, but everything. Every human endeavor they excelled in. So their nonfiction is great too. I've been reading a huge amount of Victorian literature this month. I just haven't been making videos about all of it. The one thing I'm proud of, the one exercise of will that I managed, was not to reread The Way We Live Now. The hosts of Victober made The Way We Live Now into their group read. I'm sure there was some sort of discussion forum for it. It's a wonderful novel. I've read it a few times since I joined BookTube, so I resisted doing that. But I've read a lot of nonfiction, including the thing that I want to talk about today. The author is Charles Kingsley, who was born and grew up as a young man in the Georgian era, in the era of the Wicked Uncles, but spent the full daytime of his life and creative powers in the Victorian era, and is famous for The Water Babies, or maybe Westward Ho. But he wrote a lot. He wrote a lot of other things, including periodical deadline writing of the type that I always say is my favorite thing to read on this channel. Authors who, even when they become famous, have ever done periodical deadline writing continue to do it, usually until their coffin lid is nailed closed, usually well to the end of their life, well to the end of their mental powers, and sometimes, as in the case of Gore Vidal, well beyond the limit of their mental powers, where they are still submitting, because it's just a reflex. Once you have it, you don't get rid of it. But in Vidal's case and a few other cases I could mention, not Kingsley's case, the stuff they're submitting to their old editors, the old editors, first of all, are dead, and the stuff they're submitting is unusable. But it's not. Kingsley oversaw a couple of collections of those periodical pieces. It's not that I'm talking about today. Instead, it's a history. It's this, Sir Walter Raleigh and His Times. Sorry for this cover. I just pulled it off the internet. There's, of course, no modern reprint of this book, nor will there ever be, largely because of the way we think of our history and our biography, which I have said many times on this channel, I think is ungenerous, to put it mildly. Someone, whether an enthusiastic and eloquent amateur like Kingsley, or a professional like a whole raft of historians from this period in America and UK that I could list for you, they come to all this to their subject with all the research, all the good intentions, all the acumen, and all the rigor that they can bear on the subject, and we disregard that. We disregard it and just put it aside. We say, if a history or if a biography of Sir Walter Raleigh is more than 50 years old, then it must be bad. We're not going to read it anymore. It's spoiled. It's had some sort of sell-by date. That isn't any more true for history and biography if it's really well done than it is for fiction. It would never cross your mind to say that you're not going to read a novel that was written earlier than 1930. If anything, it would cross your mind to say the opposite. I think that this is an outgrowth of an attitude that will be in the crosshairs for the next old beloved BookTube event. Nonfiction November is an event designed to stop people from thinking about nonfiction that way. If something is only the product of the latest accumulation of sources and expert opinion, if it can go out of date, it follows, as night must follow day, that writing will be boring. It will be dry. It will be basically the latest book report. And great nonfiction is not like that. And the fact that we largely think it is, still, that most readers largely think it is like that, is the reason why we discard things like this. Like Kingsley's book on Sir Walter Raleigh. It extends even into academia. Raleigh scholars, I don't think there are any. He was a man, he was vigorously heterosexual, he was white. I doubt there's anyone studying him or allowed to study him. But if someone were to do that, maybe he's in China or in a Russia ruled by a vicious dictator, maybe you're still allowed to study these sorts of things. If someone were to do that, I'm sure that their reflexive reaction to something like Charles Kingsley's meditation on Walter Raleigh would be, it's worthless. But it isn't. Some of them are, of course. Plenty of history that's written today is worthless, but the good ones aren't worthless. It's true that you probably wouldn't want it to be your definitive study of the subject, but if you know the subject, these things are wonderful. Not just because you have to assume, if we're being charitable, you have to assume that the writer of these books went to the local library, got out all the books, was obsessed on the subject, chased down original letters, chased down all sorts of monographs, did their due diligence, in other words. It's absolutely wrong to say that Charles Kingsley, who was nuts, he was nuts, but he was extremely intellectually capable and unbelievably scrupulous. It does him a total and unjustified injustice to say that he would have just dashed this off. If you can prove that, sure. If he writes in, sarcastic letters to friends that he is just dashing off something for 60 pounds, fine. But if not, then not. Our assumption has to be charitable. And even though you come at this, written, well over 100 years ago, 150 years ago, even if you come at this that way, cautiously, saying, well, he would have had the prejudices of his time, and I'm mainly comfortable with the prejudices of my time. Of course, we don't say that, right? The all-knowing among us, the terminally online among us will say that Kingsley might have the prejudices of his time, but when I get around to writing my feminist, whatever you're allowed to write in academia today in America, I will not be sharing in the prejudices of my time because I am morally perfect. That's why I act the way I do. That's why I have alienated all of my friends and family and all of my colleagues and don't have any friends, because I am morally perfect. I have finally reached that point. After all these millennia of humans existing on Earth, I have finally reached that point. If you think that way, then you're naturally going to look at something like this and think, well, it must be choked to the eyeballs with the prejudices of its day and is therefore worthless. I would like to think that most people reading history for fun would come at it a little more humble than that. And realize that the fact that a writer indulges in the prejudices of his day does not necessarily disqualify his work, especially if the writer has, as Kingsley did, an amazing amount of eloquence. The Victorians, just in general, had an amazing amount of eloquence. So, would I suggest his book, Sir Walter Raleigh and His Times, as your first book on Sir Walter Raleigh? No. Would I suggest that you should read this without knowing a good deal about not only Raleigh, but also the Elizabethan era? Probably not. Kingsley was writing to a far more educated age, people who came out of what we would call grammar school in the 1860s, knew a lot more about a lot more stuff than the people coming out of grammar school do today. The standard riposte to that old man shaking fist at clouds observation would be, well, they know a lot less Latin, they know a lot less French, they know a lot less of history, but they know a lot more about biology and physics, that sort of thing, than their equivalents did 150 years ago. To which I would always respond, is that so? Have you met a high school student recently? Have you met a high school student in 2021? They don't know anything about anything. It's not just that yes, they've lost the Latin and the French and the Shakespeare, but they've gained all sorts of quantum understanding. No, it's that they've lost a lot and haven't gained anything in response at all. They know how to vilify strangers on social media, but that's about it. That and also exactly how long the power source of their jewel lasts. Other than that, it's a net loss. But if you do know something about this time period, if, for instance, maybe you've read Robert Lacey's very popular biography of Walter Raleigh. He wrote a biography of Walter Raleigh about 100 years after this book came out. It also partakes of the prejudices of the time. It's really easy to spot them in the distance. The thing that I would ask, the humility that I would call for, is to remember that yours will be easily spotted in 50 years. Except there's no point in saying that to the perfect among us. Unfortunately, some of whom make booktube videos. some of them are actually in our midst, but most of them are not, and there's no use in telling these people you also have ethical blind spots. You also are not morally perfect, because they believe they are. And probably Kingsley did too, but I did say he was nuts. But if you've read, for instance, Robert Lacey's book on Walter Raleigh, you will certainly be secure enough to read somebody else's opinion. It won't kill you, and it's beautifully written. It's wonderfully done. Kingsley was coming at this story saying that the Elizabethan era was an era of greatness. I don't think there's much arguing with that. It had its flaws. Every era of greatness has its flaws, including your time on Twitter. He comes at that from that viewpoint, and more importantly, he comes at this unabashedly admiring Sir Walter Raleigh, who was not particularly admirable. Raleigh is a hero of his. If you accept that when you come into this book, it's wonderful. Just endlessly readable. It is an endlessly fun time to read. So I want to read you a couple of examples of that, just to give you an idea of what I mean. Both in terms of the eloquence and also in terms of the partisan nature. I've got two passages that I want to read here on the old second generation iPad. Let's see here. Here seems, as far as little folk dare judge great folk, here he's aligning himself with the little folk, to have been Raleigh's mistake. He is too wide for real success. He has too many plans. He is fond of too many pursuits. The man who succeeds is generally the narrow man, the man of one idea who works at nothing but that, sees everything only through the light of that, sacrifices everything to that. The fanatic, in short. By fanatics, neither military, commercial, or religious, and not by liberal-minded men at all, has the world's work been done in all ages. Amid the modern cants, one of the most mistaken is the cant about the, quote, mission of genius and the, quote, mission of poets. Poets, we hear in some quarters, are the anointed kings of mankind. At least so the little poets sing, each to his little fiddle. There is no greater mistake. It is the practical, prosaical fanatic who does the work, and the poet, if he tries to do it, is certain to put down his spade every 5 minutes to look at the prospect and pick flowers and moralize on dead asses till he ends up a Nero, fiddling melodiously while Rome is burning. And perhaps that is the secret of Raleigh's failure. He is a fanatic, no doubt, a true knight-errant, but he is too much of a poet for all that. Now, I think you can see what I mean. That is not anything like you will find in a modern biography of Sir Walter Raleigh. There have been a couple in the last 10 years, and they've been very good. I've reviewed them. I'll try to, since I'm talking about Walter Raleigh, I'll try to leave a link to various writings that I've done of him. I've written reviews of a couple of those biographies. I think I also wrote a meditation on the Penguin version of his History of the World. I'll try to find all of those links. Some of my links are not findable, but if I forget, the approach that I always suggest here is just go to Google, type in my first name and my last name, and then the subject. Type them together in the search bar, and you'll get a lot. You'll get all that's out there. But I want to give you one more thing here. This involves an interesting subject, a fascinating subject. Sir Walter Raleigh's relationship with the Earl of Essex, the last real favorite of Queen Elizabeth I. And Raleigh, of course, had been a favorite of hers for her whole life. So what is their relationship between the two? And it turns out that on that subject and every other subject involving Raleigh, Kingsley has a lot of opinions. So he returns. He's returned from his voyages here, having written to Cecil, that is Elizabeth's foremost counselor, William Cecil, her little hunchback, the highest praises of Essex, whom he treats with all courtesy and fairness, which those who will may call cunning. We have as good a right to say that he was returning good for evil. There were noble qualities in Essex. All the world gave him credit for them, and far more than he deserved. Why should not Raleigh have been just to him, even have conceived, like the rest of the world, high hopes of him, till he himself destroyed those hopes? Those of you who are not thumbnail familiar with this, Essex led a rebellion against Elizabeth. For now, storms are rising fast. Notice the present tense. A lot of this book is in the present tense. It's incredibly page-turning to read. On their return, Cecil is in power. He has been made Secretary of State instead of Bodley, Essex's pet, and the spoilt child begins to sulk. On which matter, I am sorry to say, historians talk much unwisdom. About Essex being too, quote, open and generous, etc., for a courtier, and, quote, presuming on his mistress's passion for him, and representing Elizabeth as desiring to be thought beautiful and affecting at 60 the size, love, tears, and tastes of a girl of 16, and so forth. It is really time to get rid of some of this fulsome talk, culled from such triflers as Osborne, if not for the darker and fouler sources of parsons and the Jesuit slanderers, which I meet with a flat denial. So here he's mentioning historians who are in bookstores. They are in at least secondhand bookshops. And of course, those wily Jesuits. There is simply no proof. She in love with Essex or Cecil? Yes, as a mother with a son. Were they not the children of her dearest and most faithful servants, men who had lived heroic lives for her sake? What wonder if she fancied what she saw of the fathers in the sons? They had been trained under her eye. And what wonder if she fancied that they could work as their fathers worked before them? And what shame if her childless heart yearned over them with unspeakable affection, and longed in her old age to lay her hands upon the shoulders of those two young men, and say to England, Behold the children which God, and not the flesh, has given me. I swear, you could just read that forever. You could just read it forever. You could go on and on and on. That was twice as much as I planned on reading. That is the joy of these things. That is the joy of current history as it's being written. If you're reading current history and it's not thrilling you with the words on the page, not historical insights, but the words on the page, if it isn't thrilling you, then you're reading bad history. You're reading bad nonfiction. So this is my effort to bridge the gap between Victober and nonfiction November. If you're, obviously history is not written like that anymore, but if your history isn't thrilling to read, then you're reading the wrong history. It's not history's fault. It's the selection that's at fault here. So that's my author and my book for today, Charles Kingsley. We can go on and on. We can talk for an hour about what he was like and the weird places that a beloved classic like The Water Babies came from. And I could also talk for 10 hours about Sir Walter Raleigh. Charles Kingsley could last me an hour. I could go on about Raleigh forever and ever. But this book is delightful. I'm sure that on Project Gutenberg it is free. I'm positive that it is. It must be. All of Kingsley must be free on Project Gutenberg. I would urge you in the ramp up to Nonfiction November, when you're finding old authors like this, to hunt around for the nonfiction that they wrote. I guarantee you they all wrote it. And give it a try. And see, that's all. That's going to be kind of the refrain of Nonfiction November, is give it a try. So that's my farewell to Victober for 2023. I had a wonderful time reading all of these, rereading all of these Victorians, talking to you about them, and also searching out the hashtag, searching out Victober videos and watching to my heart's content. They have been unabashedly nerdy, just unbelievably nerdy in the best way imaginable. A way that the Victorians have been bringing out in readers since the readers were themselves Victorians. So this has been delightful. I'm sure I'll be back to Victorian literature in the course of BookTube, even without a Victober 2024. But I want to wrap up my observations of this event this time around. It was wonderful fun. I hope you all enjoyed your Victober. So I'll end this here, and I'll see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.